Hey everybody, welcome to our virtual midweek Bible study. This is for Wednesday, December the 22nd. And you know what that means? In our household, the kids are just buzzing right now because in just a few short days, it'll be Christmas. Christmas Eve coming up Friday, Christmas on Saturday, and I hope you have every plan in the world to spend some time with friends and family and just enjoy being together. We enjoyed our first congregational meal together just this past week, and it was fantastic. We needed that. And so I'm going to say, I'm not your doctor. I mean, obviously, if you have concerns, you might want to choose otherwise. But I'm going to suggest if you've been down and you've been very burdened and lonely over these last 2 years, and you haven't really had much time to spend with family and friends, make a plan to do that. It's going to do your soul good. I think we've all been on cloud nine since being together. It was really good for the congregation to come together like that. Just spend some time together over a meal. That's been so delightful. And I want to encourage you to do the same thing. I know the kids all get excited about the presents, but it's really about time shared with each other and association and reunion and fellowship. If you have a chance to do that, I'm going to encourage you to do that. It's going to uplift your soul. And more than that, plan to be with us Sunday for worship. Come be with us on Wednesday evenings for Bible study. Come Sunday night for worship. There's nothing that replaces the assembly. We would encourage you to do that. I'm suggesting it's time to get back to doing the things that need to be done. Life needs to resume, and too many people have been shut up in their houses for such a long time. You need association. You need to be with somebody, with friends, family. You need to do that. What a better time to start than right now. I say that because of how energized we have been since our congregational meal this past week. It was just great, and I'm suggesting that you do the same, that you resume life as normal. Take your precautions if you need to. Do what you got to do to mitigate risk, but get back to normal. Hey, while I've got you here, and before we start our study tonight, can I ask you to do a couple of things? Can I get you, if you're on our YouTube channel, to hit the subscribe button? That's right below the video. If you see that on the video, it's just sort of like usually a red bar right beneath that says subscribe. If you've never done that before, please hit the subscribe button and boost our subscriptions to the YouTube channel. That helps us with advertising, publishing, things of that sort. It also helps you never lose a video. So if we post something to YouTube, you're going to be notified. You will never miss content. That's a good thing. Mutual benefits. So we help each other by doing that. If you're on Facebook, give us a thumbs up and share the video on your timeline. That's really important on Facebook. So we're a public page, so people have to like our page in order to follow the page. But we have several hundred people that do that, which is great. We're appreciative of that. But we're only limited to those several hundred people. But if those several hundred people then share the video on their timeline, it means we gain access to exponentially thousands of more people through that. So a video that may reach 200 people may end up reaching 30,000 or 40,000 or 100,000 people if everybody shares it and then they share it as well. So please do that. Okay, let's get to our study. We've got a lot to cover tonight. We are nearly done with our study of the scheme of redemption, and we're trying to finish out our summary, bringing it all together. And we started that last week. So if you missed last week's lesson, you may be doing yourself a favor by going back and watching that first. I think it's lesson 10, the first part A. This is going to be part B. So last week we introduced the subject of covenant. A covenant. We said that a covenant is, from a biblical perspective, there are three of them, right? So you go back to the beginning of the Bible and you can read up until really the first few chapters of Exodus about the patriarchal era. And then you move from patriarchy into the law of Moses, and you move from the law of Moses all the way up to the New Testament, where you have the New Testament. So you have patriarchy, the Mosaic or Levitical priesthood, and then you move to the New Testament or the covenant of Jesus Christ. You have those three periods of time. And what we're looking at is the similarity under each of those covenants. There's something similar about all of them. Now, what we were ending last week, and we said that obviously there are unique features to each of those covenants, right? They had conditions that were different than other covenants. Under Patriarchy, at one time, God required people to build an ark for salvation. Well, he didn't do that under the law of Moses. That was a unique circumstance, and that applied to that particular head of household. But in the law of Moses, we have a set of conditions given to the people, and everybody was required to do that, a certain term of entrance. Even in the New Testament, we have different terms of entrance and some different standards, but the principles that run through these covenants are exactly the same. We have a covenant, and that covenant is continued through a priesthood under each covenant and sacrifices made by those priests under each of those covenants. You have priesthood and sacrifice and covenant. And that's what we're talking about. This is how God accomplished the scheme of redemption in every single age of time on earth. And we didn't make it to the point, I think, in the video last week, but we want to make the point today that the covenants are not contradictory to each other. They had their uniqueness, each had a uniqueness to it, but they weren't contradictory. And I've opened my Bible to Galatians 3. I think this is a really important passage. Paul is anticipating that there might be some objections by people when he's been saying it from the beginning of the book, that the law has been replaced by the faith. We're not under the law anymore. We're under the faith of Jesus Christ, the faith being the gospel. And they might object to that. So in verse 19, he anticipates their question. So he answers it. He says, what purpose then does the law serve? Why have it, Paul? If what you're saying is true, why have the law? He said it was added because of transgressions till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator. So it had a purpose. So someone might ask, verse 20, he says, a mediator is not a mediator from one, but God is one. God's one side of the mediation. So someone might ask then, verse 21, is the law then against the promises of God? Now they're thinking in terms of, well, then why did God make a covenant with Abraham and make those promises if the law was never intended to be satisfactory for the scheme of redemption? Ultimately, why have that? So was it contradictory to the promises that God made to Abraham? And Paul said, certainly not, verse 21. For if there had been a law which could have given life, truly righteousness would have been by the law. Now what that tells us is that these systems leading up to the New Testament, Patriarchy, the law of Moses, they were successive systems, right? They're to be viewed as a step. The law of Moses built upon Patriarchy. The New Testament is the fulfillment of all of the foreshadowing of both of those previous covenants. And in each of those covenants, there was perfection in what they were designed to accomplish. I think sometimes we can come across as giving a bad rap to the covenants that preceded the New Testament. And we never should do that because they were perfect for what God intended for them to accomplish. In fact, in Romans chapter 7, when Paul is speaking about the law, now he talks about here his struggle under the law. He really struggled under it because it didn't provide ultimate satisfaction of the scheme of redemption. He never could quite understand that. But he says in verse 12 of Romans 7, therefore the law is holy. That's how we should view it. And the commandment, speaking of the law, holy and just and good. So how dare we ever speak of the law of Moses, or Patriarchy for that matter, in any terms less than glowing? These systems were given by God, and they perfectly satisfied what God wanted to accomplish at that time, leading us toward the New Testament. So even though they were distinct from each other, all of them were complementary and needful in order to bring us to the New Testament. Now, between the three covenants, we see distinctions. I mentioned that just a moment ago. Most of all in what was revealed regarding the plan of redemption. Very little was given, some more was given, finally all was revealed. So there's progression in the covenants. In the patriarchal system, there was some understanding. I think they understood a little bit. I mean, obviously, It was impossible for them to know as much as was understood under the law of Moses, because you have this sort of progressive revelation, right? So you have some revealed and a little bit more revealed later, but I think they understood some, and you kind of get that when you read Job, right? Job was talking about a redeemer, somebody that would stand between him and God. He understood the need for that. Abraham maybe in some way understood some of those things, but not to the degree that it was ever understood under the law of Moses, because so much more was revealed under the law of Moses. And so man's understanding, our understanding, was being developed and prepared for the fulfillment of all of the Old Testament anticipations. Understanding of God and His nature, the full revelation of God, could only be understood in relation to the scheme of redemption. That's the only way that would ever be really fully, truly understood, is when it was realized in Jesus Christ. For example, in Romans chapter 5, just real quick, in Romans 5, if we were to start in verse 6, where he starts talking about in due time, Christ died for the ungodly, and he gives the example. Some people would, you never die for a bad man. Some people would maybe give their life for a good man. But in verse 8, God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than having been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. That's all scheme of redemption. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled. See that word reconciled and justified? We were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. Much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only that, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received the reconciliation. Well, we would never understand that, right? We would still have the mind of a person living under the law of Moses, or maybe patriarchy, but at the very least, the law of Moses, at the very most, the law of Moses. But now we understand it differently, because we have the fulfillment of that in Jesus. We get to see this side of it. So there was always a progression in revelation, the way it worked through the Bible. Man was in great need of learning how God rewarded and punished people based on his word. Our understanding of human life, both purpose and life beyond the grave, was all developed from the beginning until the end. So there are 3 covenants, but not everything was understood to the degree in those covenants that it is now under Christianity. But as different as those covenants might have been, there's still some similarities between each of those. And one of those is, in every single covenant, there was an emphasis on life. The goal of every single covenant was to have people live, to have life. For example, in Genesis 3:22, so this is under Patriarchy, when God worked with heads of households. In Genesis 3:22, there was the tree of life. God wanted man to live. He wanted him to stay connected to that, but could not allow him to after sin had entered the world, but there was life. See Deuteronomy 30, verse 15, and you can read from verse 15 down through, I think, verse 20, and God repeatedly says, choose life that you may live. He wanted people to live. And then in the New Testament, John 10:10, the thief comes but to steal and kill and destroy. I'm come, Jesus said, that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. John 10, verse 10. Or John 14, verse 6, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me, by me. So the emphasis of the New Testament, just like it was in the Old Testament, both in Patriarchy and the law of Moses, is life. And life is gained through sacrifice. Remember that connection? We said life for life. Sacrifice gives life. So every covenant, because it emphasizes life, centers on sacrifice. It becomes the overwhelmingly obvious theme in every single covenant. Now, there are differences, obviously, right? But the only differences are whether one points toward the ultimate sacrifice or whether it's the ultimate sacrifice, essentially. I mean, that's the difference, is where you're dealing in the Old Testament with some that are types and shadows of what is to come. That's the only difference. But all of those sacrifices worked for one grand purpose, which is to give life. Some of the means of making sacrifice might have been different. What God required of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob was different than what he required in the law of Moses, and specifically where the sacrifice had to be made, but I mean, essentially you're dealing with whether those sacrifices worked in anticipation or in fulfillment of the same scheme that worked all the way through the Bible. Now, because everything in the Bible is connected and points to the full end of redemption, we expect those three covenants to bear some amazing similarities to each other. So, despite whatever differences, those subtle differences that may have existed, so here are some similarities that exist between these covenants. And we'll see where we make it. We may end up having to go one extra lesson because I don't want to rush through, but I'm trying not to get stuck on certain things. But let's look at some similarities between the covenants. So number one, in every covenant, okay, and let's define again, we mean patriarchy, the law of Moses, the law of Christ, the New Testament. In every single covenant, number one, there is priesthood and sacrifice under that covenant. And why is that? I mean, why would that be the same? Well, because sacrifice is necessary to make atonement and ratify the covenant. You can't have a covenant without blood ratifying it in some way, and that blood is what makes atonement. So, for example, let's look at a couple of passages that talk about sacrifice and priesthood under every covenant, and some principles that go along with that. So, if you will, turn your Bible to Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews 9, and I'm going to start reading in verse 15. This is a principle that applies across the board for covenants. And for this reason, now he's speaking of Jesus. Jesus, is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death. Right, he had to die, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant. Took his death to provide redemption, that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. Without his death, we would be lost and without hope. For where there is a testament, that would be a covenant. A testament is a covenant. Where there's a covenant, where there's a will, there has to be also the death of the testator. There has to be blood shed. All right, because that's what he's going to say in verse 22 when he says, according to the law, almost all things are purged with blood. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. There has to be the shedding of blood, verse 16, in order for there to be the enactment or enacting of that covenant. So patriarchy had its own sacrifices. The law of Moses had its sacrifices. The law of Christ had its sacrifice. Notice I said that singularly. Verse 17, for where a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. So there has to be some form of a death. There has to be death and blood shed in order for a covenant to be ratified. Now, we have that, right? So it's different under patriarchy because while you have a general time frame, patriarchy, God spoke directly to heads of households, and sometimes he made individual covenants with people under that, like with Abraham. But even when he made an Abrahamic promise, there was a death of an animal and blood was shed. He did the same with Isaac, Jacob. He did the same with all of those men. So how about Exodus chapter 24? I'm going to turn my Bible back to Exodus 24. Exodus 24. And we want to look at verse 3 through verse 8. Okay, so verse 3. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. This is the covenant, right, that he'd received at the top of Mount Sinai. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said, we will do. They did for a little while. Not long, but they did for a little while. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. So verse 8, Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant. That's important language, which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. And so he ratified the covenant with animal blood. Well, what about the New Testament? Sometimes before the Lord's Supper, depending on where you're attending, or whether you're in the Church of Christ at all, you may not see the Lord's Supper if you're in a denomination, but in the Lord's body, in the Church of Jesus, we take the Lord's Supper every Sunday. And sometimes our men have a little devotional thought right before the Lord's Supper. Depends on where you're at as to whether you do that or not. A lot of times they will read Matthew 26. And one of the verses they will read is Matthew 26:28, where Jesus said, in instituting the Lord's Supper, "This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." So his blood ratified the New Testament. So there has to be sacrifice, the shedding of blood, in order to enact a covenant. Now, let's bring in the priests, because priests under the covenant are the people that make the sacrifices. A priest is a person who offers sacrifices. That's the role, the function of a priest. And it's required for every single covenant. If there's a sacrifice, there has to be a priest to make the sacrifice, and that's part of the covenant. So the priests make the sacrifice, the blood is shed in order for atonement to be made as part of the condition for redemption, the scheme of redemption, under every single covenant. So what about under patriarchy? Was there priesthood under patriarchy? Yes, there was. Generally speaking, it was the head of the household who served in that capacity. But you see it. You see it early in the chapters of Genesis. You see it in chapter 3 and 4. For example, Cain and Abel, even though Cain's wasn't accepted, Abel was offering blood sacrifice. Abel was making offerings. There had to be animal blood shed in Genesis 3. It would be expected that Adam would have had a hand in that as the head of a household. Even in the early chapters of Exodus. What about Exodus chapter 3? I'm going to turn back since my Bible's already in Exodus. Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Okay, so Moses has left Egypt. He's married. Jethro is his father-in-law. Now, as verse 1, chapter 3, verse 1, now as Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, the priest, perhaps indicating he was a high priest, but he was the priest of Midian. Or how about you have Genesis 14, going back, you got Melchizedek. He was both king and high priest. King of Salem, high priest of that same place. So you have so many examples of that in the Old Testament under patriarchy. Well, what about the law of Moses? Well, you have the Levitical priests. And if you'll read Leviticus 8, 9, and 10, those chapters, you have some of the duties outlined for the priests being of the tribe of Levi. The only thing that leaves now is Christianity. If it's true that every single covenant has a priesthood to make the sacrifices, to make atonement, because sacrifice is life, and life is the emphasis of every covenant, then there must be a priesthood under Christianity. And is there a priesthood under Christianity? Absolutely. Well, who's our high priest? Well, Jesus is our high priest. I want you to go back with me to Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8, and look at verse 1, beginning. Hebrews 8, verse 1. Now, this is the main point of the things that we are saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected and not man. Well, who is that? That's Jesus. Jesus is our high priest. What about us? Do we serve as priests? Excuse me, absolutely, yeah. 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. Look at verse 5. Excuse me. 1 Peter 2, verse 5. You also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. Drop down to verse 9. Speaking of Christians, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. Excuse me, my throat is so dry. It's like that usually first thing in the morning, so I'm sorry I take a sip every now and then. A royal priesthood. We are priests in service of God. Jesus is our great high priest. And then under every single covenant, the law or the covenant provides direction and regulation. It regulates our behavior under that system of priesthood and sacrifice. So there's a covenant, patriarchy, the law of Moses, get it right there. And then over here would be the New Testament. So you have these three covenants, and under every one of them, there's regulation and direction for our behavior and for justification. So under every law, patriarchy, the law of Moses, and the law of Christ, we have direction that regulates our behavior and moves us toward justification and provides conditions of pardon. It does it in every single one of those. How about Romans 3, verse 20? Romans 3. I'm going to look at Romans 3, verse 20. And notice in verse 20, he says, "Therefore by the deeds of the law no flesh shall be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin." And then if you drop over to chapter 4, verse 15, he says, "Because the law brings about wrath, for where there is no law, there's no transgression." All right? So the law in and of itself, and he's talking about the law of Moses there, could not provide ultimate satisfaction for the scheme of redemption. But the point he makes elsewhere is that without the law, there's no definition of sin, no sin, and thus no ability to understand and have justification or reconciliation of that covenant. So in every covenant, there were conditions that helped us understand how to be justified according to the conditions of pardon that God provided. All right, so I wanted to get through number 2. We're not going to make it. So I'm going to put a peg in it here. So here's number 1. In every covenant, there is priesthood and sacrifice. And then I'm going to go ahead and give you the second one, and you can do some study on this. Number 2, in every covenant, there are unchanging principles of pardon. Unchanging principles of pardon. And specifically, there are 4 of them, and I want you to do some research on this until we come back together after Christmas, before the new year. So next Wednesday, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about, in every covenant, there was God's grace, God's law, our faith, and then whatever work of obedience he required. And when you have grace and faith and law and works in every covenant, you have the coming together of everything that was essential in every covenant to tap into the blessings that God provided through priesthood and sacrifice. And by the end of that, hopefully we'll have a pretty clear picture of redemption. And then we're going to add a third to that. There's one more, and that is in every covenant there's direction for spiritual life and worship. Spiritual life and worship. But we've got a lot to cover next week, so it's going to be a full week too. So one more week of this. And by the end of that, I'm hoping what we have is a very clear picture of redemption in the Bible. It's a lot. It's meaty stuff, I know. And that's why Paul, or whoever wrote Hebrews, I shouldn't have said that. Sometimes I say that just accidentally, but whoever, Barnabas, Apollos, Paul, whoever wrote Hebrews, the Holy Spirit wrote it through one of those men, or maybe somebody we don't know. That's why he said, when they were considering the priesthood of Jesus, he said, "We have a lot of things to say and hard to be said because you're dull of hearing." And what he meant by that was, this is tough subject matter. The priesthood of Jesus is tough stuff. It's deeper than what we normally get into, but it's necessary for us to understand how God brought redemption into the world. And what I'm hoping is, like I said last week, that you're able to now look at the Bible and say, look, this Bible makes a lot of sense now because I can see how God through the ages worked out my salvation. Okay, we'll put a peg in it here. I hope you have the best Christmas ever, and I hope you'll take my advice for what it's worth and spend some time with family and friends. If you've not been together and done that, do that. It's going to be good for you. I hope you'll be with us Sunday. Be with us Sunday, worship with us, come be with us and see what the church is about if you don't know anything about the church. Otherwise, come be with us and come to Bible class 9:30 in the morning. Come to worship 10:30. Come to PM worship at 5 p.m. And I hope you'll take us up on that and see you then. And then you can tell me how great your Christmas was the day before. Hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy yourself. And please know that until that time that we see each other again, I love you and God loves you even more. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.